They called him Vlad the Impaler, a name that still makes historians hesitate and the bravest whisper. Was he a monster born of madness, or a misunderstood ruler forged by betrayal and blood? In the shadows of medieval Europe, while kings fought for crowns and priests preached salvation, one man built his own legend, made of screams and sharpened stakes. He didn't just kill his enemies, he displayed them, turning execution into a theatre of horror that made even the mighty Ottoman Empire recoil in fear. They say he dined among the dying, nailed Turkish ambassadors' turbans to their skulls, and that his forests of impaled bodies stretched for miles, a grotesque monument to absolute power. But here's the disturbing truth. Much of what we know about Vlad III Dracula lies between propaganda and paranoia. Was he the most ruthless tyrant in history? Or a genius of psychological warfare who understood fear better than any other ruler? And what if the real Dracula was far darker than the character Bram Stoker created? Because, unlike fiction, Vlad's victims were real. Every act, every torture, every execution was calculated, not just for pleasure, but to rule through terror. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation about his death, and what was found buried with him, will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, fear, and human nature itself. Before we dive deeper into this abyss, subscribe to the channel and hit like, not just to support the content, but because every interaction tells YouTube that you value this kind of raw, real, and uncensored history. That's how this video reaches more people like you, people who want to uncover the truth that time tried to bury. Comment below what shocked you the most. Was it the impalement, the death banquet, or the fact that some historians still defend his methods as necessary? The choice is yours. Close this video and forget, or continue and face the cruelest truth Europe ever tried to bury. In the frozen heart of Transylvania, in a small stone fortress surrounded by dense forests and mist, a boy was born in 1431, destined to become one of the most feared and fascinating figures in history. His name was Vlad, son of Vlad II Dracula, a knight of the powerful Order of the Dragon, a Christian brotherhood created to defend Europe against the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire. The symbol of the dragon, representing faith, loyalty, and the fire of divine justice, would forever mark the destiny of this family. And as if by a cruel irony of time, the same symbol that once stood for protection and courage would become synonymous with fear and darkness. Dracula meant the dragon, Dracula the son of the dragon. And so, before he even knew how to wield a sword, young Vlad already carried the weight of a name the world would never forget. Vlad's childhood was shaped amid intrigues, conspiracies, and betrayals that plagued the Wallachian court. He grew up hearing whispers of coups, broken pacts, and public executions that fed the people's fear. His father, a man torn between Christianity and the forced alliances with the Turks, tried to maintain the independence of his small territory caught between two giants, the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. This constant struggle for political survival would cost the family a heavy price. At the age of 11, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were handed over as hostages to Sultan Murad II, in exchange for the promise that their father would remain loyal to the empire. In the Ottoman court, far from home and surrounded by enemies, Vlad learned the true meaning of the word fear. There, he learned to speak Turkish, studied military tactics, and plunged into a world where obedience was enforced with steel and blood. Every public punishment was a calculated spectacle designed to inspire terror. Mutilated bodies, severed heads on display, impaled victims, all served as reminders that power needed no love, only fear. Vlad, still a teenager, watched everything in silence. He saw the Sultan's soldiers march with ruthless precision, nobles punished for minor mistakes, and understood that in that world, mercy was weakness. Years later, in accounts preserved by European chroniclers, a phrase attributed to him would become legendary. I learned that fear rules faster than gold or faith. Mercy is a luxury that costs the throne. Though brief, this phrase reveals the birth of a philosophy of power that would define his life. For Vlad, terror was not a consequence. It was a tool, a strategy for survival in a world where compassion could mean death. During his captivity, Vlad developed a cold, calculating gaze. While other hostages surrendered to despair, he watched, absorbed, and waited. They say he learned to smile when his captors humiliated him, as if memorizing the faces of those who would one day be punished. Living among the Turks taught him the value of patience and the strength of answers. There he understood that true power lies not only in the sword, but in the mind, and that fear, when used wisely, can control entire armies without a single drop of blood being spilled. When his father was murdered and his family betrayed by the Wallachian nobles, the young prisoner realized his time would come. He kept silent, feeding on his bitterness. The hostage of yesterday would become the executioner of tomorrow. And so, in the dungeons and golden halls of the Ottoman Empire, the monster the world would learn to fear was born. The prince who would turn fear into a weapon and punishment into spectacle. But Vlad's story is not only about cruelty. It is also about pain, loss, and destiny. With each passing day, he became less human and more symbol, the perfect product of an age where entire kingdoms rose and fell in the name of survival. When he finally left the Ottoman court and returned to Wallachia, he was no longer the same boy. The hostage had vanished, and in his place stood the son of the dragon, ready to reclaim his throne with blood and fire. The world did not yet know it, but it was about to meet the ruler who would redefine the meaning of fear. For the boy who had been humiliated swore never again to kneel before anyone. And what he did next would forever change the history of Europe and give birth to one of the darkest legends of all time. After years as a prisoner of the Ottomans, Vlad returned to his homeland in 1448, carrying on his back the weight of captivity and in his hands the coldness he had learned in silence. The boy hostage had become a hardened man, forged by pain, humiliation, and an uncontrollable desire for justice, or perhaps revenge. When his feet once again touched the soil of Wallachia, he found a country fragmented, devastated by betrayal and corruption. His father, Vlad II Dracula, had been murdered by the very nobles who had sworn loyalty to the crown. His older brother Mircea had been buried alive by enemies. And the throne, once the symbol of honor and power of the Dracula family, was now nothing more than a chair stained with blood and disgrace. Vlad's return was not a celebration, it was an omen. For a time he remained silent, observing, studying the movements of the boyars. Those same nobles who controlled the land and the fate of the people. They were men of apparent refinement, dressed in silk, but with hearts rotted by ambition. Vlad knew that to rule he would have to cut out the roots of decay before they consumed him. In 1456, at just 25 years old, he decided to act. He reclaimed the throne and began what chroniclers would later call the purification of the nobility. The story of the Banquet of Târgoviște would become one of the most controversial and symbolic episodes of Vlad's life. He sent lavish invitations to all the boyars and their families, announcing a great feast in honor of Wallachia's unity and prosperity. The nobles arrived in elegant attire, bringing their wives, children, and servants. The atmosphere was festive. Wine flowed freely, music echoed through the halls, and Vlad, seated at the head of the table, smiled. But behind that calm gaze lay something dark. At a certain moment, the prince rose and made a toast to loyalty, a toast that, ironically, would be the last for many in the room. With a discreet gesture, he ordered the doors locked. Guards appeared like shadows, and the laughter in the hall turned into muffled screams. Vlad announced, in a firm voice, that this banquet was a trial. The nobles who had betrayed his father would be punished there before everyone. The elders were impaled right in the hall, and their writhing bodies became part of the macabre decor. The younger ones, terrified, were spared only to meet an even crueler fate. They were forced to march uphill under the scorching sun to build with their own hands the castle that would serve as the fortress of their new king. Chroniclers tell that Vlad dined calmly among the dying, raising a goblet of wine and declaring that Wallachia was finally clean. That scene would become one of the most powerful and repulsive images in European history. What was madness to some was justice to Vlad. He believed he was purifying the kingdom, freeing the people from parasites who for generations had drained their wealth and manipulated power. In his view, fear was the only language the corrupt could understand. The massacre had an immediate effect. Chaos gave way to order. Crime decreased. The borders strengthened, and Vlad's name began to be spoken with a mix of reverence and terror. To the people, he was a ruthless yet fair ruler, a protector willing to do whatever it took to keep Wallachia standing. To foreigners, he was a monster. This duality would shape his entire legacy. Hero or demon, avenger or executioner, it depended on who told the story. In a letter sent to the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, Vlad tried to justify his methods. He wrote, "I am not cruel without reason. I only punish those who mistake freedom for corruption. Terror is the only justice the unjust can understand." This almost prophetic phrase encapsulated his political philosophy. For him, cruelty was not a whim, but a tool of governance. And though his actions seemed brutal, his logic was simple. Order was born of fear. Those who survived the banquet were forced to work to exhaustion, building the legendary Poenari castle, the fortress that would become the symbol of Dracula's power. Every stone laid bore the weight of punishment and obedience. The castle, embedded in the mountains, seemed to defy the heavens themselves, a living metaphor for its creator's soul, cold, isolated, and unbreakable. But behind the apparent calm of his victory, Vlad was becoming a prisoner of his own methods. The more fear solidified his rule, the more isolated he became. Trust died with the traitors, and paranoia replaced diplomacy. Yet, at that moment, the prince believed he had finally restored the honor of the Dracula family. The captive boy had avenged his father and rebuilt the throne upon the bones of his enemies. However, the shadow of the Ottoman Empire was rising once again on the horizon, and Vlad knew that the true enemy had yet to be faced. The internal terror was only the prelude to a much greater war, a war against the most powerful empire in the world, where he would show both East and West what it meant to face the son of the dragon. Between 1456 and 1462, Prince Vlad III, known as Dracula, built what many historians still call a true theatre of horror. But unlike a spectacle meant to entertain, his stage was the very land of Wallachia, and his audience, the entire world. He had discovered something that few leaders ever understood so precisely. Fear could be more powerful than any army, more effective than any law, and more enduring than any alliance. He was not a man who ruled out of pleasure in pain, but a strategist who turned cruelty into state policy. At that time, Wallachia was a small kingdom squeezed between giants, Hungary on one side and the Ottoman Empire on the other, and any sign of weakness meant extinction. Vlad knew this and chose to rule not with compassion, but with terror. Criminals, thieves, conspirators, and spies were impaled not only as punishment, but as public messages. Every body raised on a stake, left to rot in plain sight, spoke clearly. Here, mistakes are paid with pain, and betrayal with eternity. They say the forests of Wallachia seemed to come alive. Not with trees, but with bodies hanging in silence, forming geometric patterns visible for miles. The sight, the smell, and the sound of the dying created an atmosphere no one dared to challenge. The most controversial, and perhaps the most symbolic, act of his rule occurred when Ottoman ambassadors came to his court in Târgoviște. Out of respect for Islamic tradition, they refused to remove their turbans before the prince, a gesture that to Vlad sounded like defiance and insult. Calmly, he is said to have remarked, "Since your turbans are so sacred, may they remain forever upon you." And he ordered his guards to nail the turbans to the men's skulls with iron spikes. Chronicles say the hall fell into absolute silence. Vlad did not shout, did not gloat. He simply watched as blood spread across the floor. Later, in a letter attributed to him, he wrote, "Better a forehead wounded by faith than a head bowed in submission." The message was brutal but clear. He wanted to show that Wallachia would kneel to no one, not sultans, not kings, not foreign gods. This act echoed across neighboring empires and strengthened a reputation that was becoming ever more terrifying. The prince who defied the world's greatest empire, using terror as his shield. Vlad's fear knew no borders. Foreign merchants who deceived him were impaled along the roadsides, so that travelers would see their bodies before crossing the borders. Local traitors were displayed in public squares, and rumors of their executions spread like wildfire across Europe. But here lies the most fascinating paradox. Under Vlad's rule, Wallachia became one of the safest places in the region. They say that in his time, doors could remain unlocked at night, and a golden goblet could be left in the town square without anyone daring to steal it. Fear had become a form of peace. The people, though terrified, saw in him a protector. They called him a tyrant, but also a guardian. The line between justice and cruelty grew ever thinner, and perhaps even Vlad himself no longer knew where one ended and the other began. His system of terror functioned like a precise machine. Each execution was public, theatrical, and symbolic. He knew that pain, when displayed, taught more than any decree. The suffering of one served as a lesson for 1,000. His goal was not merely to eliminate enemies, but to shape the collective mind. Vlad turned punishment into political art. The stakes were not just instruments of death, but pillars of a new moral order. A warning to the dishonest, a mirror for the cowardly, and a promise to the loyal. Accounts from the time speak of forests of bodies stretching to the horizon. Travelers described the heavy silence of the roads, broken only by the cawing of crows. Even Ottoman soldiers, hardened by war and brutality, trembled when crossing the borders of Wallachia. When spies reported to the Sultan what they had seen, many refused to return. To the world, Vlad had become the devil himself. To him, it was merely strategy. There was a cruel and logical reasoning behind it all. The greater the terror, the smaller the need to fight. Fear was his invisible fortress. And though chroniclers described him as a sadist, his methods worked. Enemy armies hesitated before attacking, and conspirators thought twice before betraying. The horror, so carefully staged, kept the throne firm and the people obedient. But the price of such stability was high. Thousands died, and Vlad's name began to turn into legend. German pamphlets portrayed him as a bloodthirsty monster, and even his allies began to fear the intensity of his power. He, however, did not waver. He said that a ruler should not seek to be loved, but feared. For love changes, but fear endures. Vlad's theatre of horror was not emotional chaos. It was a conscious tactic, a meticulously constructed performance, designed to ensure his survival in a world of betrayal. Throughout those years, Prince Dracula solidified his reputation. To some, he was a hero who saved his people from the claws of the Ottoman Empire. To others, a beast who fed on human suffering. Either way, the result was the same. Everyone feared him. Fear had become his crown, and silence his oath of power. However, the game of terror has its limit, and Vlad would soon discover that fear, when it spreads too far, begins to consume even the one who wields it. The next chapter of his story would show how the same instrument that raised him to power would also completely isolate him. Behind the image of the bloodthirsty and merciless prince, there existed a man far more complex than the legends allowed to be remembered. Vlad III, the Impaler, the same man who turned terror into politics and pain into a symbol of authority, was not merely a sadist thirsty for power. He was, according to many ancient chronicles, a deeply religious man who believed he was fulfilling God's will by punishing sin and purging his land of corruption. Before executions, it is said he would kneel in silence and whisper prayers, not out of pity for the victims, but asking God to guide him in his mission to cleanse Wallachia of evil. This duality, faith and violence, turned his mind into a battlefield between spiritual duty and the burden of blood. In letters sent to other rulers, Vlad often mentioned God, divine justice, and the fate of corrupt men. He believed that each impaled body was an offering to restore the order that had been broken. For him, mercy was a form of weakness that corrupted nations. Many of his contemporaries called him a tyrant, yet some say he saw himself as an instrument of providence, a soldier of God in a world consumed by lies and betrayal. Outside the battlefields and political audiences, however, the man Vlad seemed weighed down by silence and solitude. He married twice, but tragedy followed him even within his castle walls. His first wife, whose name history never recorded, lived by his side during the most turbulent years of his rise. She was described as brave and intelligent, a woman who believed in her husband's purpose and followed him faithfully. But fate, as always, was cruel to the son of the dragon. During the siege of Poenari Castle, when Ottoman forces climbed the steep slopes to capture Vlad, she, believing her husband had been killed and that she would be taken prisoner, threw herself from the top of the fortress, choosing the abyss over humiliation. Her body disappeared into the waters of the Argesh River, and when Vlad discovered what had happened, he reportedly said in a rare moment of weakness, "She chose the abyss over servitude." Perhaps it was she, not I, who was truly free. That phrase has echoed through the centuries, revealing a human side history has often tried to erase. He, the man who instilled fear in all, also knew the taste of loss and helplessness. They say that after his wife's death, his gaze was never the same. There was something broken behind the coldness. Later, he married again, this time to a Hungarian noblewoman connected to the court of Matthias Corvinus, the King of Hungary. The marriage, however, was more political than romantic. The union served to strengthen alliances, but never filled the void left by his first wife. Vlad had children, but none inherited his throne or his legacy of power. Some were sent to other courts, others vanished into the shadows of history. The blood of the dragon diluted over time, and the name Dracula survived more as myth than as lineage. In the final years of his life, Vlad was consumed by a growing paranoia. The man who once commanded entire armies began to distrust even his allies. His advisors feared him, his friends avoided him, and the few who still served him did so out of fear, not loyalty. The voices of his past, the victims, the betrayals, the battles, seemed to haunt him in dreams and waking hours alike. Some chronicles tell of nights when the prince wandered alone through the castle corridors, murmuring to himself as if answering ghosts. Isolation consumed him. Fear, once his greatest weapon, now turned against him. No throne is safe when it is built solely upon terror. Vlad became a prisoner of the very system he had created. He knew that any misstep could mean his death, and with every new political alliance he saw another conspiracy forming. His mind, once sharp and calculating, now mixed faith with delirium. Some say he began to believe that even God had abandoned him, and that his punishments, once justified as divine, were now sins weighing upon his soul. Still, until the end, Vlad kept his proud bearing. He prayed, fought, and punished with the same fervor. He never admitted regret. To him, the world was divided between the strong and the weak, and justice belonged only to those brave enough to impose it. He was a man who lived without half measures, driven by absolute convictions and unshakable faith in his mission. And perhaps that is what made him so terrifying. Not the brutality itself, but the certainty that he acted in the name of a higher purpose. In the last decade of his life, Vlad was no longer the monster of popular tales, but a weary man haunted by his own deeds. His once severe face bore the marks of loneliness and guilt. The throne he had reclaimed with blood no longer brought him glory, and the power he had sustained through fear now left him completely isolated. No one dared come too close. The King of Pain had become a prisoner of his own reputation, and thus emerged the tragic figure of a man who believed he fought for justice, but in the end was devoured by the very shadows he created. The monster the world remembers was, at his core, merely a man trying to survive in a time when compassion was weakness and cruelty was law. And the more he tried to purify the world, the more he lost himself within. The power of Vlad III, the Impaler, began to crumble not because of a foreign enemy, but due to something far more subtle and treacherous: politics. In 1462, after years of defying the Ottoman Empire with brutal tactics and bloody campaigns, the Prince of Wallachia found himself cornered by the very forces that had once supported him. His Hungarian allies, led by King Matthias Corvinus, who had upheld him as a Christian bulwark against the Turks, now saw him as politically inconvenient. Vlad had become a symbol of instability, feared by his enemies but also by his friends. His reputation for ruthlessness, which had once inspired respect, now bred unease. And so, through diplomatic intrigue and manipulated accusations, the son of the dragon was captured and kept in captivity for 12 long years. During his imprisonment, Vlad was transferred between fortresses and monasteries, often in near total isolation. Some accounts claim his cell was cold and damp, lit only by a narrow slit of light. Others suggest that at times he was treated with a certain dignity, as a political prisoner of importance. But what is undeniable is that, while he remained silent, his image began to take on a life of its own. Wallachia's enemies, especially German merchants and chroniclers, began spreading grotesque tales about the Impaler prince. Pamphlets printed in cities like Nuremberg and Lübeck circulated throughout Europe, describing him as the devil of Wallachia. In them, Vlad was depicted impaling children, bathing in blood, dining among corpses, and laughing at human suffering. These stories, though exaggerated and often fabricated, served a political purpose, to justify his imprisonment and tarnish his name. By turning Vlad into a monster, his enemies absolved themselves of the guilt of betrayal. What they did not realize was that in doing so, they created something far more powerful than the man himself, a legend that would transcend centuries. Even in prison, Vlad did not bow. According to a letter dated 1474, he supposedly wrote, "The world calls demon the man who does not fear demons." This phrase reveals the essence of his character, a blend of pride, irony, and unshakable conviction. He seemed to understand that his image had already surpassed the realm of politics. He was now a living myth. It is said he spent hours in silence, meditating, maintaining the discipline of a warrior, even in confinement. In some accounts, he is mentioned as keeping small animals in his cell, only to impale them, not out of cruelty but out of habit, as if that gesture had become inseparable from his identity. When he was finally released in 1476, Vlad was no longer the man who had ruled with an iron fist 2 decades earlier. He was older, thinner, his face marked by wrinkles and scars, both physical and spiritual. Yet his gaze, witnesses said, still burned with the same relentless fire. With temporary support from Hungarian allies and a faction of the local nobility, he reclaimed the Wallachian throne, determined to restore order and reassert his dominion. But his return would be brief. Times had changed, alliances had weakened, and his enemies, both within and beyond the borders, were merely waiting for the right moment to strike. In the same year as his release, Vlad faced an Ottoman offensive and died in battle, fighting to his last breath. Some versions claim he was betrayed by one of his own men, others that he was surrounded and slain after fierce resistance. What is known is that his head was severed and sent as a trophy to Sultan Mehmed II, the same ruler he had once humiliated. The Sultan reportedly had it displayed on a stake at the gates of Constantinople to show the world that the demon had finally been defeated. Vlad's body, according to records, was buried in a monastery near Snagov Island in Romania. But centuries later, when archaeologists opened the tomb, they found nothing. No skeleton, no remains, only stones and earth. The absence of the body fueled speculation. Had it been secretly removed by monks? Stolen by admirers? Or, as peasants whispered, had he simply never died? This gap between fact and mystery gave rise to a new kind of immortality. As the years passed, the stories about Vlad grew darker and more fantastical. Some said he had risen from the dead to wander the forests of Transylvania, thirsty for blood. Others believed he had made a pact with the devil himself, granting him eternal life. When writer Bram Stoker published his novel Dracula centuries later, the name of the Impaler prince rose from the ashes of history, this time as the world's most famous vampire. But the irony is cruel. The man who fought to be feared as a symbol of strength was remembered instead as a cursed supernatural creature. The propaganda his enemies created to destroy him became the reason for his immortality. Today, few remember the wars he fought, the alliances he forged, or the letters he wrote. But everyone knows his name and associates it with darkness. Thus Vlad III, the son of the dragon, found a form of eternity he may never have desired. He died as a man but was reborn as a myth. Between hero and demon, history chose the latter because fear always speaks louder than truth. His legacy is the distorted mirror of humanity, the reminder that power, when it knows no limits, does not die. It merely changes form. Today, more than 5 centuries after his death, Vlad III, the Impaler, the son of the dragon, the historical Dracula, still divides Romania and the world between admiration and horror. Walking through the lands of Transylvania is, in a way, walking in his shadow. To some, he is a national hero, a symbol of resistance and sovereignty against foreign domination, a ruler who faced the Ottoman Empire when all others bowed. To others, he is simply a cold-blooded psychopath, a man whose soul was lost to his thirst for control. This duality has become the heart of his immortality. The same name that inspires pride in the squares of Romania sends chills down the pages of history. In recent interviews with local historians, this perception remains divided. Many claim that if he lived in the 21st century, Vlad would be a modern dictator, endowed with an analytical, calculating mind and the ability to use mass psychology as a weapon. "A political strategist with the mind of a social psychologist," said a Romanian expert, referring to the way he understood human behavior and manipulated it with precision. Vlad knew what fear did to people, how it could unite, control, and even heal a nation when wielded skillfully. It is this mix of rationality and brutality that makes him, even today, an impossible figure to ignore. On social media and in popular culture, his name is constantly being re-evaluated. Some see him as the protector of Romanian identity, the man who halted Islamic expansion in the Balkans and ensured the survival of Eastern Christianity. Others treat him as the embodiment of human evil, an eternal symbol of how far the mind can go once it loses moral restraint. Through memes, debates, documentaries, and artistic reinterpretations, the myth of Vlad survives, now not in medieval chronicles, but in the algorithms of digital platforms. In the museums of Bucharest and Sibiu, his original letters are displayed behind reinforced glass. In them, his firm handwriting and choice of words reveal more about the man than 1,000 legends: faith, coldness, and unshakable conviction. Poenari Castle, rebuilt in the mountains, attracts thousands of visitors each year. Many climb the more than 1,400 steps to the top just to feel the heavy atmosphere that lingers among those ruins. Some tourists report chills, others swear they hear voices, footsteps, or feel a presence watching them. Some say Vlad's spirit still roams those walls, not as a ghost, but as a living reminder of a power that never rested. Filmmakers, novelists, and scholars continue to be divided between admiration and repulsion. Recent documentaries portray him not as a mythological vampire, but as the creator of the modern concept of political terror, the idea that fear, when institutionalized, can govern more effectively than love. And that may be the most disturbing lesson. Vlad was not a supernatural monster, but an ordinary man with an extraordinary mind, capable of turning fear into a tool of governance. And perhaps the most frightening realization is that in some way, many leaders who came after him learned to use the same principle. The line between hero and villain in Vlad's case is made of smoke. He is remembered in Romanian schools as a prince who fought for independence and purged corruption, but he is also cited as a warning against ruling solely through force. In tourist fairs, his image appears on mugs, t-shirts, and statues. In universities, his name surfaces in theses on the psychology of power. And on October nights, when the world turns its eyes to the vampire myth, the shadow of the real Dracula seems to smile, because he remains alive, not in horror tales, but in the collective consciousness of a humanity both fascinated and terrified by its own reflection. Perhaps that is why a phrase attributed to him in anonymous 15th century chronicles still echoes as a warning: "I am not legend, I am the mirror, and those who stare too long at me see what they are capable of doing." And that is precisely what makes Vlad the most human of monsters and the most monstrous of men. And so we reach the end of this journey through the shadows of Vlad III, the man who turned history into horror and horror into legacy. The question that remains is simple, yet uncomfortable. Was Vlad truly a monster, or merely a reflection of what absolute power can do to any human being? The answer, perhaps, lies within each of us. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you a favor. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It's more important than it seems, because every subscription and every like tells YouTube that you enjoy intense, deep, and truthful stories. That's what helps the algorithm show this content to more people, so that more can discover the real history behind the myths. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting the channel, you're helping keep alive the art of storytelling that time tried to erase. Now, I want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about Vlad the Impaler? Was it the coldness with which he justified his actions, the tragic love of the wife who threw herself from the castle, or the fact that even centuries after his death, he still inspires both fear and admiration at the same time? Write it down in the comments. I read them all and really want to know your thoughts. And before you go, don't close the video just yet. Take a look at the content appearing on your screen right now. That video is even more intriguing and captivating than this one, a story that will grip you from beginning to end and make you rethink everything you know about power, faith, and fear. Click there and keep traveling with me through the history most people are too afraid to tell.